Just out of college, and despite having a degree, it was almost impossible for me to get a job. Day after day, week after week, I sent out my resume to every game developer and computer company in the country and a few in Europe and Asia. 6 months into this, my money was running very low. This was when I was forced to face the facts. I needed a job immediately, and it didn't matter where and for how much. Just in time, I found a job listing for a video game store at the mall. You know the one I mean, and the terrible stories you hear about them are almost always true. Because of my background in games, I was given an interview immediately and hired soon after. My first shift was the following morning. Other than a few hiccups along the way, it kept my head above water until I got on with Dell 2 years later. The meat of the facts began just before my second year was about to start. Because of the high turnover, I was made an assistant manager by month 9. None of my shifts were evenings, so I was tasked with keeping the younger employees in line. A job I never really took seriously since I was only a few years older than they were. I didn't care how they acted as long as they did their job. Around this time, a girl was hired that could have been my undoing. The second I saw her, I knew she would be a problem. However, it wasn't just her that was the source of trouble. Her super jealous boyfriend became a thorn in the side of every guy that worked with her, and sometimes just spoke to her. A shift of hers didn't go by without him showing up to check on her. Some nights, he would do no more than sit on a bench outside the store and watch her work, but anytime she would get too close to a guy for his liking, he'd approach them and physically intimidate the guy she was talking to. She never said a thing when this happened. I actually think she kind of liked it, but it would be what would push her away from him in the end. She'd worked at the store for a couple of weeks before someone showed her the hallways that ran along the back of every place. She took advantage of the fact he wasn't aware of them, and this turned out to be a big mistake. If any person reading this doesn't know what I'm talking about, pay attention. You're about to learn something. I'm not sure how common this is, but some indoor malls, those built in the old way where each store inhabited an area that leased from the mall owner, there are a network of paths or halls that run behind each business. They're used mainly by the employees. The system allows them to enter and leave their jobs without being seen by the customers. Although I'm pretty sure their intended purpose was to give janitorial staff an uncluttered pathway to maintain the spaces. That being said, in all my time at that job, I only saw a member of the cleaning staff a handful of times. Most of those times, they were sneaking a cigarette rather than working. Luckily, we could still smoke inside the building back then. No one said anything to the office if they caught you, probably because they were doing the same thing on their breaks. If we are all on the same page now, I'll get to the real story. Like I said, his jealousy, no matter how it turned her on, was at the same time pushing her away. On her breaks, she'd often sneak out the back and disappear for a while. Where she went, I had no idea or really cared. The boyfriend took forever to catch on, but when he did, he was super angry. She continued this routine for a few months, and just one day, she never came back to the store. I didn't attach any importance to this. It was during the holidays and work was a nightmare. It wasn't uncommon for employees to go on break after an especially hectic rush and not return. The turnover was simply that bad. Things got a bit more interesting about 4 or 5 days later. The police showed up and had some questions about her disappearance. I was like, disappearance? What's going on here? They then informed me that she had been reported missing the day after she bailed on work by her parents. She had never made it home, and they thought we may know something. The crazy thing was that when they visited her boyfriend's place to see if she was there, in addition to him not being there, after some digging, they learned that nobody had seen either of them for about a week. I was quick to make it clear that I didn't know anything. I had just assumed she got sick of the place and bailed. I guess they were happy with that. Never heard from them again. Time passed and the situation around her almost faded completely from my mind, until something really big in February happened and brought it back into crystal clarity. Some workmen were renovating one of the store's spaces for an incoming client, and once they had completed emptying the space of what the previous renters had left behind, they began the undertaking of finding the source of a terrible smell. Initially, it had been inferred that the smell was emanating from some old food products left behind in the space, but even after the clearing, the stink remained. The next theory was that an animal like a rat had died in the wall. It had happened before. So, before they went to the extreme of busting holes in the walls to find the source of the smell, they went next door to the adjoining space that was also empty and had been for some time. They spent close to an hour sifting through tons of old displays and leftover building materials. It turned out that the mall had been using this space for years as storage and the place was a mess. The two guys tasked with doing this were about to say forget it, when one of them stumbled upon the source of the stink, and it definitely wasn't a rat. Someone had taken a large piece of plywood and put it over a tiny little closet, thus making it invisible. The guy had caught on that the smell grew worse as he got closer to this board, so he pushed aside the heavy display rack holding the board against the wall, and as soon as he pulled back the board, he found what was causing it. The semi-mummified body of what looked like a female was lying on the floor facing the wall. It appeared the arid and dry Arizona heat had preserved the corpse and suppressed decomposition. This had to have been why it wasn't stinking up the entire mall and managed to remain hidden for so long. Naturally, the mall was alive with talk of who the body could possibly belong to. Numbers of people had just stopped coming to work one day or skipped out during their lunch. We'd gone through at least 15 people in the last year ourselves. When the answer came, no one could have guessed who it was. Early one morning, I was awakened by my manager with the news that Becky Morrison was the person they found in the empty store. My only answer was, "Who?" He reminded me that she was the girl with the crazy, jealous boyfriend that had disappeared just before Christmas. I hung up and went back to sleep. When I returned from my shift that night, it was the only thing anyone could talk about. The next question asked was, who did it? The overall favorite was the crazy boyfriend. Everyone knew by now that he had disappeared just after her, and considering his body wasn't found alongside hers, it was a fair assumption. He was most definitely nuts. It made sense. The story took a whole new angle just a couple of weeks after she was identified. An article was published in the paper discussing a possible new motive behind this. The police had recently received information that Becky had been messing around with a fellow mall employee during her breaks. They were meeting in the unoccupied store her body had been discovered in and fooling around. After following some leads, they were able to identify the employee. He was a 22-year-old guy working in the Hallmark store, but no name was given. He told the officers that he and Becky were supposed to hook up the day she disappeared, but he got holed up by the time he'd reached the empty space and she was gone. He figured she couldn't wait and returned to work. It was only a few days later, when the cops showed up at the mall to ask questions, that he heard she was missing. His mind went straight to the worst, and he was afraid he'd be blamed for it, so he said nothing. Then, when the news reached him that the boyfriend was also missing, it was too late. He figured if the boyfriend was hiding out, waiting for his chance to get him, it was best for him to say nothing, just on the off chance he didn't know for sure who the guy was. It all boiled down to him being afraid, and with what I knew, I could understand. What nobody knew, and still probably doesn't, is that her and I had a thing for a short while too. It wasn't long, but once is all it takes. I was the person who told her about the back hallways, after all. We slipped out there a few times to mess around. Fortunately, we never got busted. When she moved on to the next guy, I wasn't hurt. I knew she had a boyfriend anyway. Now you know why I had to act as if though I didn't care about her. We figured it was the safest thing for the both of us. Turns out we were right. I was overjoyed no one knew about us. If the dude was crazy enough to strangle her for cheating, which seemed to be the reason, he would no doubt come after the dude she was with. I felt sorry for the Hallmark guy. It wouldn't take much mental math to figure out who he was if he didn't already know, and since they still haven't found him to this day, the fear of her boyfriend popping up out of nowhere and putting some holes in him must have been real strong. I know I was looking over my shoulder for several years after. The police have this theory that he may have ended his life not long after. There hadn't been any activity on his bank account or card for years, and I still wasn't taking any chances. 9 years later, a week doesn't go by that I don't think about her. An outsider may have seen her as an easy girl, but I still don't think of her that way. It struck me that she was just looking for a guy that would treat her well and commit to her for the long term without being psychotic about it. She was genuinely a good person, and certainly didn't deserve the end she had, but then again, I can't think of very many that do. I'm not sure if this is the creepiest or the most disgusting thing to ever happen to me, but here it is. I'm a 17-year-old female, and this happened about 3 months ago. Me and my friends always liked to go to McDonald's after we had a good yoga session. You could call us regulars. We probably did yoga together 2 or 3 times a week, and it wasn't a class or anything. It was just me and 3 of my friends. We had another friend, Olivia, who occasionally joined us, but she was kind of flaky. If she didn't feel like doing yoga that day, we just went ahead and did it without her. We had been in this routine for a couple of weeks at this point, and we always looked forward to getting some nice junk food. There was something about McDonald's that was like the guilty pleasure of my entire existence. I normally didn't get it otherwise, but I really looked forward to the couple of occasions that me and my friends went there. But this one experience was horrible. I had been there enough that I started to recognize the people that worked there. I never had conversations with them, but I knew their faces well enough to spot when someone new was in the back working. That's exactly what happened this one Wednesday afternoon. I noticed this guy with really thin hair. He had a really creepy face, and I'm not sure how to describe it exactly. His eyes were humongous. They looked like the eyes of a bug. And then he had this really strange body language that always kind of freaked me out. It was like jumpy or something. If he was deep frying French fries, for example, he would stand perfectly still for a second, and then really quickly submerge them in one motion, and it would splash grease all over. This was very unusual considering I had seen enough people put down fries that there was an easier way he could have done that. He didn't have to splash it like that. I was watching him one day and we made eye contact. It was really unusual too because I was looking at him as my mom's credit card was processing to pay for my meal. He had his back turned toward me. I was trying to figure out if I knew who he was, and then he just spun around to look at me, and it was all in one motion. It was just really freaky. So I started noticing him more and more. He was always working whenever my friends and I got finished with our yoga. It didn't bother me too much. My friends also noticed how weird he was and told me about similar experiences. It wasn't creepy enough that we stopped going or anything, but it was certainly enough to notice. I remember the day in particular. It was a weekend because I didn't have school that day. Me and my friends had just finished a really good yoga session and we headed over to McDonald's. Anyway, my friends and I ordered our food and were waiting for a few minutes. It took a little bit longer than usual, which isn't really an issue because we're not impatient or anything. But here was the weird part. They weren't busy. We were basically the only people in there waiting for food, and I think they had one other person who had already ordered who was sitting down and already eating. I didn't see any cars in the drive-thru, and I just found the whole situation extremely bizarre. I had noticed that the creepy guy was working, but I didn't see him for a very long time. He went behind a wall that I couldn't see him around, and I wasn't sure why he did this either. Life went on, and we got our food and sat down. I normally start by eating my fries and then have whatever my main meal is after that. Today it happens to be chicken nuggets. I got a 10-piece. As I was eating, I felt that creepy guy's watchful eyes looming over us. I felt really freaked out, and I convinced my friends to take our meal into the car to leave. As we left, I looked back to see him frowning at me. I didn't stop walking. Well, we got out there, and for a few minutes I felt like I was being paranoid and I overreacted. My friends thought so too, until I looked at my chicken nuggets. I looked inside of the box they were in, and they seemed to be covered in some kind of weird substance. I couldn't quite make it out, and I didn't know what to think. My immediate reaction was that they had put mayonnaise on it or something. Thankfully, I was smart enough to ask my friends before I took a bite. My one friend screamed, "That freak jizzed on your nuggets." The more I analyzed this strange substance on my chicken nuggets, the more convinced I became that it really was, in fact, that. That certainly explains why it had taken so long for us to get our food. I didn't quite understand how he was able to pull it off, though. He was one of at least 5 other workers there. It's not like they would have just allowed him to do this, right? Whatever the case may have been, I didn't feel comfortable eating those chicken nuggets, and I threw them out without hesitation. My friends and I were all really freaked out that this had happened to us. My friends threw out the rest of their food just to be on the safe side. We weren't really sure if we should have reported this incident to the police or something. We really didn't know what to do. We just kind of laughed it off as being one of those crazy life experiences, and that was it. I haven't gone back to McDonald's since this whole experience. But yeah, that's the story of how I ordered chicken nuggets one time, and the freaky guy working there put his secret sauce on them. Okay, I don't think you guys are even going to believe this story, but it's 100% true. Just happened last week. I don't know how else I could even preface this dumpster fire of a story, but here it goes. I'm a 22-year-old male and I live with my fiancée. We had a nice apartment, but we were really looking to buy a house. I know, a little young for that, but we both landed really nice jobs after college and figured that it's better to get it out of the way now and start settling down. We're kind of old-fashioned like that. My fiancé's grandmother owns a home and no one lives in it. She had it for about a year since a family relative passed away. No one wanted anything to do with it since there was a lot of work that needed to be done, like painting the walls and redoing the floors and just various tasks like that. It wasn't completely horrible inside, but there was enough work that it literally sat there for a good little while. Well, my fiancé and I started talking to her grandmother after buying the place. She told us that she would sell it to us for a low enough price that we would be able to afford all of the renovations and whatnot. We were really excited about it. It was really exciting to think we were going to have purchased our first home together so shortly after graduating from college. But here was the problem. She had a lot of people in her family who started feeling left out. It was my fiancé's aunt and her 2 sons. Their father had died shortly after the second son was born, and the mother had a hard time coping with everything. She was a regular drinker and arguably an alcoholic. My fiancé told me that they were extremely negative people, and after meeting them a few times at family functions, I was surprised at how right she was. They lived in government housing. She collected disability fraudulently, and her 2 sons didn't work, despite one being 24 and the other being 19. There were whispers of drug abuse in there too. Suffice to know that these were not the kind of people you wanted to associate with. When word got out that we were buying the house from her grandma, they started feeling really left out. There were a few occasions where they'd try offering to watch the house, very obviously an attempt to get in there and do God only knows what. We politely declined and did everything we could to avoid them. I happened to be at the house one day. My fiancé was working and I work remotely online, so I was home alone. I had just walked down the street to buy a lemonade when I saw someone at her house. It was extremely unexpected. I got ready to confront a potential burglar when I noticed it was my fiancé's cousin trying to break in. He was startled when he saw me and froze for a minute. I asked him what he was doing, and he told me something about thinking he saw a car he didn't recognize in the driveway. I explained that it was my car, and he left without any big confrontation. As he walked away, though, I heard him start cursing under his breath. This was the point when I started feeling like we had something to worry about. Not feeling safe inside your own home is the worst feeling ever, especially being two young recent college graduates. We both worked really hard to make this happen, and the idea that it made us feel unsafe there really bothered us. I still didn't even understand what they wanted out of the whole ordeal. They didn't have enough money to afford the property tax alone. Forget about utilities and anything else. About 2 weeks went by without any kind of confrontation. I had falsely convinced myself that they'd finally leave us alone. I was dead wrong. We went to McDonald's one day, exactly 1 week ago today, the day I'm writing this. Me and my fiancé both just wanted to be out of the house for a little while. Considering we were in the process of buying a house, we didn't want to go eat anywhere expensive, so McDonald's just seemed like a logical decision. Now, before I continue, I feel the need to explain something about my fiancé and I. We are normally very serious people. We work very hard and we're both kind of workaholics, but when we get together to have some fun, we go hard. Work hard, play hard, right? Well, we got kind of silly when we played. Let me cut to the chase. We were both playing in the ball pit at our local McDonald's. We always enjoyed goofing off like that, and we weren't too concerned with what people would think of us. We'd only been messing around for 5 minutes when her cousin showed up at McDonald's too. It was creepy. He walked right in, looked at us the entire time. Before he even opened the front door, his eyes were stuck on us, and they felt heavy. My fiancée immediately knew something was wrong when my facial expression changed and she darted around to see what I was looking at. We both watched as her cousin made his way out to the ball pit. He stepped outside. As he walked, he moved his body to grab something out of his pocket. I couldn't see what it was, but my first thought was a gun or a knife. The look in his eyes told me he was out to do serious harm. He jumped into the ball pit in my direction. I luckily landed one solid punch in his face as he came down. It threw him off. I had an advantage. He kicked me in the stomach, but I landed a few more punches on his face. He started screaming for me to stop and that I was killing him. I would have kept going if my fiancée hadn't been watching. He started this, not me. We got out of the ball pit. He then began telling us that he was going to press charges on me for assaulting him. I wasn't even fazed by this. There were plenty of witnesses there that had seen the whole thing transpire. I started telling him that I was calling the cops and I was going to press charges on him. He got really panicked and ran back to his car and drove off. I'm not going to lie to you. This whole thing really shook me up. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to do. I looked around online and found an easy solution. A restraining order. My fiancée and I had both gotten restraining orders on her aunt and her 2 cousins. I didn't know why we didn't think of this sooner. It really solved the issue, and once they understood that we had a restraining order against them, they buggered right off. I haven't seen or heard from them since. And thankfully, and hopefully, that's the end of my story. My name's Gerald and I'm 22. For the past year, I've encountered a buttload of crazy people and have accumulated even more crazy stories. While most of them would make you laugh, the one I've chosen to share was terrifying while it was happening and still gives me shivers when I remember it. A little more than a year ago, I applied for and got a job at my favorite convenience store across the street from my house. I'd moved there my sophomore year in college and decided to stay after I left school. This little store has served as a savior to me. Living as young men often do, I had very little money, but I was always confident I could find something to fill my belly regardless of how much was in my pocket at the time. So, when the time came, I was no longer able to rely on my parents for money. The corner store was the first place I went for a job. I was in luck. Only the day before, one of the employees was fired for stealing from the register. I took his place, and I've been here ever since. Like any other corner store, we sell alcohol. Beer, wine, liquor, the whole boat. Naturally, this makes us a beacon for the local drunks. These folks have served as countless hours of entertainment. While most are harmless people, On one specific occasion, a horribly violent outburst occurred. It was a quiet Saturday night, about an hour before close. Most of the regulars had made their appearances, a few more than once. The two involved in this incident had been in around 7 p.m. and had just returned. They were, or at least appeared to be, a couple. I'd seen them around the neighborhood since I moved in. The owner of the store said they'd been customers since he bought the store, and that was 13 years ago. Although they were not very talkative when they came in, I never had any reason to believe either could be violent. However, that night something had changed. Upon arriving the second time, they went straight to the cooler containing the quart and 40-ounce size beers. Nothing out of the ordinary, as I said, but tonight an argument between the two started soon after their arrival. Initially, I couldn't hear what it was about, but soon I could hear everything they said across the store. I minded my own business for a while, but once the female began screaming curse words at the man, I felt like I had to at least get them to take it outside. I wasn't sure what to say, but I began my walk to the opposite side of the small store. Before I was halfway there, the man started screaming back at the woman. I'm not sure exactly what she had said to him, but it had obviously infuriated him. Mere moments before, he had taken a quart bottle of Busch or some other cheap beer from the cooler. All of a sudden, he began striking down at the woman's head with it. I'm not sure if he thought it would break or if he intended on hurting her with the nearest thing, but strike after strike he continued. It was a horrifying thing to witness. I blame the entertainment industry for giving people the false impression of how easy it is to break a beer bottle over someone's head. I assure you, it's very hard. Following the fifth or sixth strike, the woman had dropped completely to the floor and stopped moving. The guy stood over her for a moment, but looked up when I assume he heard me running towards him. The second he saw me, he ran out the side door and disappeared into the darkness. The sight of her laying there made me sick to my stomach. The blood dripping from her ears was almost as shocking as the ever-growing pool around her head. It seemed like a bad idea to touch her, so I made the decision to let the paramedics check her for a pulse. When they arrived, she was still alive, but they didn't have much hope for her survival. The cops certainly weren't in any hurry to get there, but when they did finally arrive, 45 minutes later, I filled them in on all I had seen. From the way they reacted, I got a strong feeling that they were very familiar with the two. While on shift, a few days later, my boss called with some news. The female was brain dead, and her family had made the choice to let her pass. The cops had picked the guy up the following night. From the description my boss gave me, he didn't even seem to remember what had happened. The doctors that examined him said that it's likely he truly may not remember what he did, because of the many years of alcohol abuse had possibly destroyed his brain. Sounds like he might not get the full punishment due to him under the law. I'm not really sure how I feel about that. Sometimes, it seems like people really do get away with murder. During my time in college, I had a friend whose dad owned an 800-acre piece of land in eastern Texas. In the past, he leased it out to hunters and paper companies, but was no longer doing it. He had built a cabin on the land a few years before and would let us go out there from time to time to mess around. It served as a great way to relax from the pressures of school and getting closer to nature. The spring break of 1997, we loaded up our trucks and headed for the cabin. Our plans included shooting guns, drinking beer, and other things rednecks like us do in the woods. Our first morning kept us pretty busy cleaning the cabin and moving all our stuff inside. Around dinner, we made a big fire outside and cooked a bunch of steaks and fried potatoes. We skipped dessert and broke open some beers. The sun went down not long after, and for the remainder of the evening, we got loaded and passed around a joint or two. At some point in the night, I heard a shuffling noise outside and went out to check on it. The fire was barely burning at that point, and just outside of its light, I swore I could see the shape of a man standing completely still. From what I could tell, he was facing me, perhaps waiting to see what I would do. I blinked my eyes real hard to get a clearer look, but my position and the lack of light made it hard to see clearly. The shape continued to stand still, so I decided I'd walk up a little closer in hopes of getting a better picture. The thought terrified me, but I was transfixed by the being. Or perhaps I was still too intoxicated to make wise decisions. I took 2 steps forward, but was distracted by a voice behind me. My friend had woken up and noticed the door was wide open. So he got out of bed and saw me walking around the fire. His voice caused me to jump a little, but I soon realized who it was speaking. I asked him if he saw the figure on the other side of the fire pit. He just laughed at me and said I must be so stoned I was seeing things. We laughed it off and returned to bed. On my way, I turned back to take one more look, but the shape was no longer there. I chuckled to myself and went back to sleep. The next morning, I wrote the whole experience off as the result of too much fun and went on with my day. We spent the first half of it fishing at the big pond. Post-lunch was shooting guns and one guy's compound bow that he had just bought. The beers and smoke were broken out after dinner. A game of poker was attempted but soon canceled in favor of another evening telling lies around the fire. On one of my many trips to relieve myself that night, I was spooked by the sound of a stick breaking close by and noped it back to the fire. The look of fear on my face made the other guys laugh their butts off. I tried to explain what had happened, but was quickly reminded that we weren't the only creatures in the woods. The reasoning seemed sound, so I accepted it. Not long after, we were standing around, involved in some deep discussion, and I turned to speak to the guy on my left. What I saw caused me to clench up so tight I could have snapped a steel rod with my sphincter. Standing within a few steps behind my friend was another man I did not recognize. It was like he appeared out of nowhere. What made it creepier was that he was staring intently at the back of his head, almost like he was trying to bore through it with his eyes. I remained frozen stiff. The longer I looked at him, I realized he was the same being I saw lingering outside the light of the fire the night before. He was average height with a long, unkempt beard. My friend continued rambling about whatever, unaware of his shadow. After several long seconds, the stranger turned to me with a blank expression and walked away. This was when my friend finally noticed my horrified look. When he spoke, the thrall of fear was released, and I began pointing and rambling about what I had just witnessed. He and my other friend laughed at me again. There was no way I was seeing things this time. I described the man, and one of them suggested he was a Bigfoot. Despite my protestations, no one was buying it, and I eventually cut my losses and shut up. However, I wasn't beat. Their mockery had made me even more determined to prove the stranger's existence. The next 2 days were quiet. No stranger, in other words, but I kept my eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. By our 5th morning, I was beginning to question my sanity. I'd seen this mysterious being stalking around us twice, and now it had suddenly disappeared. I resolved to put my quest on the back burner until some new evidence arose. My friend's dad had mentioned him, an owner of one of the surrounding properties, had spotted a small group of wild hogs running through his land, so we grabbed our rifles and went on the search for them. A mile or so down one of the property's many roads, we came across some hog wallows and knew we were on the scent. We went up the road, now on foot tracking them. Another mile on, we stumbled upon 3 large hogs rooting up the ground and prepared to make bacon. 2 of us chambered around as quiet as possible on our rifles and took aim. I was less than a second from saying 3 and pulling the trigger when the loud crack of another rifle filled the air, followed closely by a burst of wood and bark above my friend's head. It took a moment for it to register that we were being shot at. A few seconds later, another crack and strike, this time even closer to my friend. We weren't going to wait for a third. The friend who appeared to be the target led us down a side trail that led back to the cabin. No more shots followed as we fled. However, instead of finding safety at the camp, the shots began again. Seeing no other option, we hopped into my truck and hauled it out of there. This was a time just before the commonality of cell phones, so we had to drive the 20 miles to town to get help. After we explained the situation, we returned to the property a few hours later with some deputies. We approached slowly and remained in the cars when we parked. We waited to see if the shots would start again, but nothing happened. A cursory look around counted 3 holes in the cabin and another 2 in my buddy's windshield. Perhaps the worst was that all of our camping stuff, sleeping bags and such, were spread out all over the ground. Luckily, we'd smoked everything the night before, so the police were none the wiser. Nothing was missing but a box of .30-30 ammo and, strangely, my sleeping bag and wool blanket. A theory began to form in the deputy's mind that we had stumbled upon a squatter or poacher camping out on the property for whatever reason. They acted as if they were going to let it go, but once my friend's dad, who owned the land, heard about it, he put pressure on them to start a search. This was about the time I repeated my story of seeing someone lurking around the cabin. No one was laughing now, and my story was finally being taken seriously by somebody. The search was led around the property by my friend's dad. School had already begun again by the time it took place. It continued for a full week, but nothing other than a few old camps were found. It was assumed that he knew the heat would be on him after the shooting incident, and he moved on. During the course of the investigation, several avenues were followed to ID the stranger like escaped cons, but he remains unidentified to this day. Because of the chance of another attack, our trips to the property ended. The next year we tried to camp out somewhere else, but it wasn't the same and our nature getaways died out. Within 5 years, my friend's dad had a heart attack and lost interest in the cabin. The paper company's lease were renewed and the land's trees have been used to make paper and pulpwood products ever since. Each time I jot down a quick note, I'm reminded of our awesome trips and especially the odd and terrifying week that caused them to stop. I do, once or twice a year, talk to my old college friends on the phone. As far as he's heard, that crazy stranger still hasn't been caught. We sometimes theorize as to his origins and where he may have ended up. I, however, often take this much further when I'm alone. I wonder why our so-called strangers seem to focus so much of his anger onto my friend, and perhaps, far more concerning, is he still out there waiting for his chance to finish what he began all those years ago? I live in a major city in Texas. My apartment complex is gated and in a good neighborhood, but the security isn't extremely tight. Sometimes the gates are left open and anyone could piggyback off of someone else entering with the access code. Maybe twice in the past 3 years, the management has put out notices of vehicle break-ins and other items being stolen from porches. We also have frequent door-to-door solicitors, even though there are signs forbidding it. So this particular Friday evening, I go to bed at about 2:30 a.m. For some odd reason, I was having trouble getting to sleep, so I put on a podcast to listen to and eventually start to doze off. I become aware of a noise that sounds like a clicking sound, but it sounds like one of my upstairs neighbors making some noise. I kinda zone this out, as I'm used to my neighbors staying up late on weekends. After about 30 seconds, I realize the noise is extremely repetitive and getting louder. I then start focusing on it more intently, trying to isolate what it could be and where it was coming from. Suddenly it hits me. It's coming from the entrance to my apartment. I leap out of bed and head to the foyer. I identify the noise right away. The lock mechanism is moving back and forth rapidly, like someone is trying to unlock the front door. I can hear that an object is inserted into the lock and the person is jimmying it back and forth with a lot of force. I instinctively turn around, head to my bedside safe, unlock it with a combination, and pull out my .357 SIG pistol, load a 14-round magazine, and chamber a hollow-point round. I head back to the door, and as I exit the bedroom, I see the lock twist and unlatch. I immediately pointed my weapon straight ahead, knowing that if someone comes through, I will have to make a split-second reaction. I decide that if someone comes through my door, I will give them a momentary chance to retreat, but if they do anything other than that, or enter aggressively, I'm going to shoot and ask questions later. They don't enter. However, because I had also locked the deadbolt inside only, When I first moved in a year prior, I remember thinking that the deadbolt was a great security feature, and I got in the habit of always keeping it locked when I'm home. In hindsight, this decision saved me from a life-or-death confrontation. Upon realizing that, I approached the door and looked through the keyhole. On the other side are 3 Asians, 2 men and 1 woman. All 3 are wearing hoodies, so it's difficult to make out their faces. The men have objects in their hands, but I can't make out exactly what. The 2 men are talking back and forth, probably trying to figure out why they can't open the door, even though they have successfully opened the outside lock at this point. The woman is also talking loudly behind the 2 men, such that anyone in the hallway would be able to hear her voice. She's talking in another language. The only words I can make out are blah blah blah, apartment 250, blah blah blah, and she keeps repeating that over and over like a broken record. Upon hearing that, I start to wonder for a moment if maybe they're just drunk and have the wrong apartment number. But that's impossible. To open my lock, they would have to have a copy of my exact key or some kind of lock-picking device. I've never copied my key or even given it to anyone. And here's the other thing. Not only is 250 not my apartment number, but, as I figured out later, that apartment number doesn't exist anywhere in the complex. Standing back from the door, I take a long broom handle and jab it hard in the face of the door, letting them know that I'm on the other side. They immediately stop fiddling with the lock and take off running. I debate whether to call 911 and decide against it until they return. I know they'll be long gone by the time anyone gets there. It would be too risky to follow them to try and get a better description or license plate, and I don't have enough identifying info as it is to make an arrest. I filed a police report the next day and let the apartment management know. They said it was unusual, but they would alert the resource officer and ask for a police presence for a couple of nights. Nothing ever came of the report, but that's not a surprise to me. It's been 7 months since this happened and no further incidents. Nobody else in the apartment has reported anything similar happening. I don't think they'll be back, but one precaution I took was to buy a smart lock for the deadbolt, so I can leave that deadbolt always locked from the inside, even when I'm not home. It's crazy to think that the deadbolt was the only thing between myself and an armed confrontation with intruders. They say you don't really know what you'll do in those situations until it really happens, but I can honestly say I am proud of how I stayed calm and was mentally prepared to defend myself. If there's one good thing that came out of this, I feel confident that I responded the right way and was ready for the unthinkable. I've had a few delivery jobs that have given me the creeps. 1 or 2 that I was pretty sure I was about to be robbed. Another was a gunfight between gang members unfolding in the street I was delivering to, right as I was turning onto it. But these are just occupational hazards. Yeah, it sucks, but I guess you do get over them. Only one delivery job really, truly terrified me. The only one that scares me to think about even today. So we get an order from an address that none of us drivers had ever delivered to before. This normally causes some suspicion among us since we're always pretty wary whenever delivering to a new address. A fair few first-time deliveries have resulted in an address getting blacklisted. Sometimes they try to stiff you for money or some other scam to get free pizza. Generally speaking, the drivers take turns delivering to a new address, and this time, it just so happened to be my turn. So once the order is completed and the pizzas are boxed up, I take them out to my car and punch the address into my sat-nav. It turns out the address is right on the edge of our delivery area, pretty much in the middle of absolute nowhere. It dawns on me that this could be the oldest trick in the book. Call the pizza into some hard-to-reach location, then demand it to be free once it takes more than 45 minutes to deliver. But, to my relief, I make it out onto this old dirt road with time to spare. Yet my relief doesn't last long, not when I see the state of the address I'm delivering to. The house is so run down it looks like a squat, like it's been commandeered by the homeless as a place to avoid sleeping rough. There's a musty old pickup in the driveway, its wheels all askew from years of misuse. I mean, the place was just the very definition of haunted house. Needless to say, I wasn't expecting a particularly generous tip. As I take the pizzas out from the passenger seat of my car, I start hearing this faint, whining noise. My ears prick up immediately and I freeze, trying to work out just what the sound is and where it's coming from. I come to realize it's the sound of a violin being played, but more accurately, it was the sound of a violin being played very badly. These discording noises carried on as I walked up the dirt pathway toward the porch and the front door. The sound of some old violin bow being dragged across dry old strings that were way out of tune. Creepy, sure, but that's not what terrified me. When I knocked on the front door, the screaming cat violin sounds ceased instantly. A few moments of silence went by before I began to hear slow, heavy footsteps growing steadily closer. I can't be certain, but I'm almost sure I heard someone breathing on the other side. These heavy, labored breaths as I waited for the door to open. The silence was broken by a metallic snap of the door unlocking, before hurried footfalls sounded on the other side. Someone had unlocked the door, then scampered away from it as if they were overtly skittish about visitors. Hello? I got your pizza order here. I remember asking, feeling the tension rise as silence once again engulfed the scene.
Come inside, mister.
A childish voice came from the other side. I wanted to just turn tail and run at this point, but returning to the pizza place without the money for the pizzas would definitely mean a verbal or written warning from my manager. I already had one for turning up late. I couldn't afford another. So, reluctantly, I took hold of the door handle, turned it, and walked inside. The interior of the house was bathed in darkness, only a handful of weak oil lamps to give me any sense of the layout. A figure was crouched on a nearby sofa, the old violin laying next to it.
There's 15 on the table there, mister.
The person sounded like a child, but they looked bigger than they should have. On the small, dusty coffee table in front of the couch, there's a pile of change in little piles. Normally, I'd have taken issue with this, but to be honest, I was desperate to get out of there at that point. I'd have taken any form of currency. As I stooped down to start sliding the little piles of coins into my cupped palm, I started to hear the kid's labored breathing again, but I dared not look towards him. I could see its legs in my peripheral vision, and even then, I could see how unnaturally long they were. This person was not a child.
Sorry about the coins, mister. I saved them up. I saved them all up to afford this treat for myself. It's all I have.
I had told the person not to worry in the sunniest disposition I could muster. The last thing I wanted to do at this point was upset them. I pocketed the coins, barely having counted them. I'd come up with a difference myself if I needed to. Like I said, I just wanted to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, hastily thanking the person, I caught a glimpse of the person's face in the low light of the oil lamps. They were burned, horribly burned up and down their arms and chest. The scarred flesh extended all the way up their face and head. Only the person's features were obscured by a small rubber mask. The mask didn't even cover up their entire face, only a small central portion that concealed their eyes, nose, and mouth. The only thing I could really make out was that the mask had a long wooden nose, kind of like the puppet Pinocchio, whose nose would grow whenever he told lies. The small carved eyes were blank. I averted my gaze from the mask and was unable to return it. It was one of the most hideously sad and scary things I'd ever laid eyes on. Just as I had reached the front door, I heard that same childlike voice emanating behind me.
Want to hear me play a song, mister?
Before I even had the chance to answer, to tell them I was too busy with deliveries to hang out, they had grabbed the old violin next to them and began to whine out of tune. Although the strings were almost totally out of tune, I started to make out the tune they were trying for. You know the one. If you go down in the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise. If you go down in the woods today, you better go in disguise. For every bear that ever there was will gather there for certain, because today's the day the teddy bears have their picnic. I was in the back of the driver's seat of my car before you could say, "Nope, I'm out," scrambling to start the engine so I could make a quick getaway. I don't think they had any intention of hurting me. I certainly wasn't as in much danger as when those idiot Crip and Blood wannabes decided to shoot it out like right in front of my car. But something about that place still creeps back into my mind while I lay there in darkness trying to sleep. Something that means I'll never, ever make another delivery there. I'll quit before I go back. I'm ashamed to say it, but it needs to be said. I screwed up on my job and a man died because of it. Not just a man I was being paid to protect. Usually it can be forgiven for making a mistake on my first job. However, when it's your first job protecting another man from outside dangers, one mistake can be the last. In retrospect, hindsight, whatever word you use, I wish I'd never agreed to taking the job. Just being a large-built man with a license to carry doesn't make you qualified to be a private security. This all being said, I took the job. The client losing his life is a direct result of my negligence. Maybe if I discuss what happened, I can relieve myself of a small amount of this burden. However, I can assure you I know the guilt will never truly fade away. The job came out of nowhere. Mike, a close friend of mine, had been a bodyguard on and off for years. He made it clear the job was a one-time only deal. No other guys he knew were available on such short notice. His next client was coming into town in the morning. Mike needed someone with a carry permit to back him up. He knew I had one, so I got the call. He assured me it wasn't a dangerous situation, but he liked to have another guy to watch his and the client's back. I was somewhat nervous initially, but the money I was offered was too good to pass up. We met up at his place later that night. He gave me a rough outline of what I was expected to do. Once it had been all laid out before me, it seemed simple enough. Although this would be his first time with this particular client, he assured me once more it would be simple. After all, the guys with the real problems always had their own staff. Our client was a regular suit and tie in town for some business. 4 hours of work and he'd be back on a plane home. The morning of the job, we met with the client at the airport. A third guy, Roger, was doing the driving for us that day. He's a retired SWAT officer who picked up the occasional driving job for Mike. He'd had a boatload of training in evasive maneuvers while he was in the Army. Plus, he could be a third gun in an emergency. He drove us to the client's first appointment, and everything was going well. From what I could make out, the dude was a wholesale jeweler out of London. Stuff didn't really start falling apart until we were leaving the second place. As we exited the jeweler's store, I noticed a sketchy-looking, possibly Middle Eastern guy. He was standing in front of the place next door. When he noticed us leaving, he pulled a knife from his pocket and ran towards us. Before he could get anywhere near us, I instinctively moved toward him. He turned and ran, and I foolishly gave chase. I'd gotten somewhere around 30 yards and heard a barrage of gunshots behind me. I turned around just in time to see Mike go down. The client was already on the ground and wasn't moving. Roger was standing next to the car, shooting at 2 men running from the scene. By the time I'd drawn my pistol, the firefight had ended. It was clear to me I'd messed up. As Roger and I checked Mike and the client for signs of life, a weak few words came from Mike. "I hope you won't be offended if I don't ask for your help again." We had a brief chuckle, but we both knew this wasn't a laughing matter. Roger confirmed that the client was in fact dead. I rode to the hospital with Mike, and Roger stayed behind with the cops. This big mess made no sense. I knew I could trust Mike. He said the client indicated no current danger to his life. We were supposed to be only there to prevent robberies. We'd both seen the guy with a load of stones on him, so no flags went up. Regardless, Considering the number of guys in on the hit, I had a strong feeling we didn't get the whole story. I'd been waiting for news on Mike for about half an hour when Roger finally showed. The cops were right behind him. Now it was my turn. When they were done with me, they wanted to talk to Mike, but he was still in surgery. 2 hours later, we got the good news. He was going to make it, but he'd be in the hospital for the next week at the least. For the next 9 days, I stayed at his side. It was the least I could do. The following morning, we had our first discussion since the shooting. You do realize the guy with the blade was a decoy, right? It became pretty obvious once I heard you all yell at me to come back. Listen, don't feel guilty. It's not your fault. I've fallen for dumber things than that. We continued our talk for a while until Mike fell asleep. No matter what he said, though, I'd always feel bad. A man lost his life, after all. The detective showed up later that day and pumped him for any new info, but Mike had none. Mike was released 8 days later. Neither of us heard anything new until Roger called Mike 5 days later with some inside information he'd gotten from one of his pals. The client had been far from honest with us. He had hired us because he was involved in a deal with some men in which he screwed them out of $100,000. They had made it known if he was to return to the States, he'd be whacked. If Mike would have known this beforehand, he wouldn't have taken the job. That's likely why the dirtbag kept it quiet. Somehow this bit of info had made it past the background check. Nonetheless, even a crook doesn't deserve to be sprayed with bullets on a public street. We were only hearing it from their side. It could have all been a huge misunderstanding. After my anger cooled, it became obvious to me that I was just deflecting my feelings onto the client. Thief or not, I was responsible for the safety of the man. Not only had my mistake gotten him killed, a very good friend of mine almost did too. When Mike's back in fighting shape, I'm sure he'll return to security work, albeit in a slightly more careful manner. I'm just glad he's still kicking. I hope he gets someone in the future far more competent than myself. When it comes to me, I think I'll stick to construction. It appears to be a whole lot safer. For a little context, I am currently a senior in college and live off campus with my 2 best friends. This time of year, particularly around Thanksgiving, my friends try to help me stay busy as it is typically a difficult time for me. My mother left our family the week of Thanksgiving when I was 8 years old, and my dad passed away 5 years ago on November 22nd. So as I said, it's a pretty easy time of year to get myself down in the dumps if I don't stay active. Every year for the last 3 or 4 years, I have gone to one of my friends' houses to celebrate Thanksgiving with their families. But this past year I decided I wanted to just stay home and have a mellow long weekend. I figured I could catch up on work as well as my schoolwork, which was pretty far behind. My roommates and I didn't live particularly close to the university. We lived in a suburb about 15 to 20 minutes outside of the school. This was nice because we didn't ever have to host any parties. We could just attend them near campus and head back home afterwards. Anyways, there was one house on our street that didn't quite match the others. It wasn't that the house was worse than the others, but it had no landscaping and desperately needed a fresh coat of paint. My roommates and I knew the owner as he introduced himself when we moved in a few years back. His name is Jacob. He's about 5'6" and probably weighed 100 pounds soaking wet. Every time we've had an interaction with him, he was always very nice and polite. He even helped us fix our porch light when it broke last summer. He seems to be very cordial with everyone in the neighborhood and has helped numerous people with small handy jobs similar to the one I just mentioned. On the Wednesday night leading up to Thanksgiving, my 2 roommates went back to their families' houses in their hometowns. They both asked several times if I was 100% sure I wanted to spend Thanksgiving alone and that I'd be fine by myself. I honestly thought I would be, and thought perhaps enough time had passed that I could just focus on other things and not dwell on the past. I stocked up on Mountain Dew so I could stay awake after my assignments to play some PlayStation. At about 9 or 10 p.m., I went up to my room to throw on some sweatpants and grab the blanket for my bed. I glanced out my window and saw Jacob sitting on his front porch with the two porch lights on. I didn't think anything of it and went downstairs into the kitchen and made a peanut butter and fluff sandwich. I would say I was in the kitchen for probably about 5 minutes or so, finishing eating and doing a few dishes. When I finally sat down to play some games, I thought I heard something hit the front bay window, so I went to take a look. At first, I didn't see anything, but then noticed that Jacob had now turned the porch lights off and was standing on his front lawn, staring at the house with his head tilted like he was looking towards the windows upstairs. A little creeped out, I tried calling one of my friends who knew I was still in town to see if she wanted to meet up or stop over to hang out for a little bit. She didn't answer, so I sat on the couch for a couple of moments trying to figure out what to do. He was still standing there staring and seemingly moving a few feet closer to our property each time I looked. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't call the cops. He hadn't done anything except freak me out a little, and to this point, he hadn't even stepped on my property. After another few minutes, I looked out the window again and saw Jacob now on our lawn looking at the corner of the house. At least that's what it looked like he was staring at. At this point, I wasn't sure what his intentions were, and I didn't want to find out. Perhaps I was blowing this out of proportion, but I was legitimately scared. I grabbed my keys and phone and a few other items, thinking I would just drive to campus. Maybe the library was still open, even though we were off for the holiday. I kept all the lights on so I didn't seem like I was leaving and decided I was going to sneak out the back door. As I quietly sneaked through the yard, I turned the corner to quickly get to my car, and there was Jacob, standing in our driveway. I asked him what he was doing in the driveway, and he put his finger over his mouth to make a shh noise. I slapped him as hard as I could and made a run for it past my car. My instincts and adrenaline told me to just run until I found someone or someplace else. As I got about a block or two down the road, I saw a bunch of cop cars pull up towards the area of my house. Confused, I began to go back towards my house, thinking perhaps another neighbor saw Jacob stalking outside of my house and called the police. As I approached the house, one of the officers asked my name and if this was my residence. I confirmed the information, and what I heard next is still the most horrifying and disturbing information I had ever received. The officer stated that Jacob reported that he was on his porch when he saw me from across the street. He saw me walk out of my upstairs bedroom, and as I walked away out of the room, he saw a man come out of my closet. Apparently that was why Jacob was looking into my room when I saw him the first time, and also why he was looking at the corner of the house. He was following the intruder who was now walking into my roommate's room. When I last saw him outside my house before I slapped him and ran in terror, Jacob stated that the random guy in my house had made it to the downstairs. Jacob was trying not to make any noise as not to alert the person inside, fearful he could be violent or dangerous. As soon as he saw the man in the house, Jacob called the authorities and did his best to try and defuse the situation and not bring any alarm to myself or the intruder. The person inside the house was arrested and taken away. He didn't have anything on him other than a knife, so it is unclear if he was attempting to rob the home or was planning something more sinister. Either way, I couldn't express to Jacob how much gratitude I had for what he did. He even tried apologizing for how he handled the situation, stating that there were probably things he could have done differently to make sure I was safe and aware of the situation. Unfortunately, this experience adds another mental scar to this time of year that will take a long time to get over. But one thing I can be sure of is that I will never spend a Thanksgiving holiday alone again. This incident occurred during my second year of college, sometime in the fall of 2002. All 4 years there, I worked as a waitress in a small family restaurant next to campus. The pay was far from adequate, but the owners treated me like one of them. Growing up without parents made this connection very important to me, so much so they remain an important part of my life to this day. I was one of 4 girls working nights, and 3 of us were students currently attending the university. The surrounding neighborhood had been on a downward slide for the past 20 years. Even with a large number of students inhabiting the area, crime was still steadily on the rise. In order to at least try to prevent ourselves from becoming victims of said crime, several safety measures were implemented. All the usual things, escorting each other to our cars, not leaving the back door open, things like that. However, no matter how hard you try to be safe, some a-hole will find a way to violate you anyway. One late night, just as we were wrapping up the dinner shift, a giant idiot would do just this and, in the process, almost cause a beautiful family to collapse. That night, we were quickly coming on the end of another regular dinner shift when a man came in and said he wanted to get something to go. No problem. I took his order and gave it to the kitchen. Working the kitchen that night was Matt, the owner's only son, and he wasn't happy when he saw it. He tried to throw it together as fast as possible so he could finish cleaning and head home. While he waited, the man paced nervously, looking outside repeatedly. This behavior seemed kind of shady, so I stopped my closing duties and began looking outside to see if I could see what he was looking at. It took a minute, but I caught sight of another man standing just out of view of the bay windows. This guy was dirty looking. His hair looked like it hadn't been washed or combed in years. The second man's actions were very similar to the others, almost as if though they were about to rob us. I foolishly pushed my instincts aside and began ringing up the man's orders. When I gave him the total, he quickly handed me a $20 bill and looked behind him. I continued to ignore his behavior, and when I opened the drawer, I heard a man's voice quietly tell me to give him all the money in the register. Maybe from instinct, I looked up to see who it was. It was all coming from the customer, and he was holding a handgun at my face. "Keep your voice down and don't panic. Just give me the money and I'll leave." This entire time I had been the only employee in the front of the house, so he had me at his mercy. Every word he said quivered as it came from his mouth. His fear made mine even worse. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed every cent out of the drawer and was about to hand it to him when I heard Matt's voice coming from behind me. "Did you forget something?" Everything that happened after this went by so fast. I still question my recollection of events to this day. I know for sure that Matt's arrival surprised us both, but the look on the customer or robber's face was pure shock. The second I noticed him moving the gun away from my face, I crouched behind the podium to hide. The gunfire followed soon after that. I wasn't sure if Matt had been shot at this point. I was still curled up on the floor with my arms over my head, very similar to a child hiding under the covers in hopes the boogeyman will go away. I don't know how long I stayed like that. A few seconds, maybe. When I did peek out from my arms, all I saw was Matt's body laying motionless on the floor. Even then, I stayed where I was until I heard the voice of his mom yelling out to us. That's when I finally stood up to see the results. The shooter was gone, and money was scattered all over the floor from where I dropped it. Matt more than likely died immediately. At his feet, grilled chicken salad was scattered everywhere like the money. Matt's mom stormed out of the back. When she saw her only son lying on the floor, she collapsed in grief next to him, and this is where she stayed until the police arrived. Just to avoid making an already long story longer, I'll leave you with the facts. Even after telling the cops everything I saw and giving a detailed description of both men, neither man was caught. The family closed the restaurant for several days after the shooting and stayed that way until a few days after the funeral. From the day of the reopening, a cop in plain clothes has protected the place, and there hasn't ever been another holdup since. My work at the restaurant would continue for the remainder of my time at the university. I was shaken up for quite a while, and may have been for far longer if it wasn't for the love and support of the family. We seemed to have served as a coping mechanism for one another, and through the shared pain of Matt's death, brought closer together. After I graduated, I moved on and am currently living in Atlanta with my partner. The restaurant continues running 5 days a week and doing well. It seems the neighborhood may be on its way up. In the last year, several large companies have opened branches, and the continued growth has proved to be a positive thing for all concerned. Allison, the matriarch of the family, recently told me on a phone call that she was willing to put up with the hipsters that were slowly invading the area. After all, They were a big step up from the murdering crackheads that had been seen there before.
Do you remember as a kid where you imagined dentists as some kind of crazy psychos who enjoy hurting people? And how they wanted to rip out all of your teeth against your will? Well, we all know now that we were just overreacting kids back then. But it wasn't exactly false for me. When one day, my childhood nightmare became a reality. And this experience is something that has forever left a mark and a trauma on me. Me and my boyfriend back then moved in together and wanted to start a new life in a new town. We both came from poor families with experiences of alcohol abuses, so we couldn't afford much, and we had to work really hard to sustain our needs. One evening, when I came back from work, my tooth started to hurt a lot. I tried to ignore it because I thought I was just tired and it would eventually go away after some time. So I went to bed and fell asleep. But in the morning, the pain got worse. I told that to my boyfriend, and he started to worry. We didn't have any insurance because we hardly even have money for our basic needs. So for us, this was a big problem. We started to search through the internet and local magazines for dental clinics, but most of them were very expensive and clearly we couldn't afford them. My condition was getting worse to the point that I couldn't even focus on my work most of the time. Desperately, I called to my parents. I begged them for help and asked to send us some money, but they refused. By now, you guys probably know what they were like, and that's the exact reason why I moved out from there. At the end of my shift, my boyfriend called me with some good news. He found a really cheap dentist in town, and he immediately made an appointment for me. He texted me the address and told me to be there at exactly 7 p.m. tonight. I packed my things from work and went to the bus stop. When I arrived there, I went into the building and sat down on a chair next to the clinic room. I could hear two people talking inside the room, so I decided not to interrupt and wait for my turn. After 10 minutes, some lady just ran out of the room like she was in a hurry or something. She dropped her wallet on the floor, but before I noticed it, she was already gone. Meanwhile, the door opened again, and a pleasant man's voice invited me in. I turned around and I could see a short, middle-aged man with a big smile. I greeted him and told him about the lady and the wallet she dropped. He said, "Oh, don't worry. She was in a hurry for a bus. You can give me her wallet. She's a close friend of mine and I'll give it back to her." I gave him the wallet and brushed off the situation. For the next few minutes, we talked and filed all the necessary papers. I told him about my toothache. He seemed so nice and funny. Then, he prepared his dental equipment and I sat down on the chair. And after that, things started to get weird. He told me to open my mouth wide so that he could start the examination. I don't know why, but it felt like he was standing too close to me. Besides, shouldn't dentists sit down on their chair while working too? Then, I felt a rubbing sensation on my arm. It was so weird. I thought it was his leg, but later, I realized it wasn't. I thought he wasn't doing it on purpose, so I tried to move my arm a bit, but his body followed my arm. He tried to chat me up to distract me from whatever he was doing, but I could feel everything. Then he stopped for some time, but a few seconds later, he just grabbed my arm and told me not to move that much. He was holding me really tight. I had enough, so I gathered my courage to tell him to stop. But he just sighed. Fortunately, a few seconds later, he released my arm. After this confrontation, he started to act harsh and rude. He seemed like he was offended and didn't want to smile anymore. Nothing really happened after that, until I finished my dental appointment where he told me to come back again for a follow-up treatment next week. After leaving, I felt so scared of him and didn't want to go back. I could see him looking through the window of his clinic with a really angry or disappointed face, like he was expecting something from me. I told what just happened to my boyfriend, but he told me I was just overreacting and we couldn't afford any other dentist. So I should be grateful that he found me a clinic that fits our budget. I knew that he wanted what's best for me, but as I said, we were in a bad financial situation, so I couldn't complain and be picky in this time. I knew I had to go back there again, but at least he did his job and my tooth didn't hurt anymore. Fast forward to my second dental appointment. I was feeling so anxious right before the meeting, but unexpectedly, he greeted me with the same big smile as before. We chatted like nothing happened and he proceeded to the treatment very professionally. Everything seemed to be okay while he was treating me. This time, he sat on a chair and didn't do anything weird. In the middle of the operation, I was looking at him and he seemed nervous. We were sitting in silence for some time when, out of nowhere, he told me, "Hey, I really like your body. You are just my type." It was so confusing and it felt so awkward. I couldn't even answer him with a fully open mouth, but I started to move my lips and replied, "I appreciate your compliment." Then there was just dead silence. I started to look around the room and I noticed the wallet. I realized it was the same wallet that I gave him a week ago after some lady dropped it on her way out. Something was wrong with this guy. My heartbeat was pounding and I started to sweat. Then he said, "Come to my apartment after the treatment, just for a tea." I immediately knew what was going on and I replied to him, Thanks for the invite, but I have a boyfriend and I respect him, so I don't want to hang out with some other men." "Come on, I don't ask you to go to bed with me. Just for a tea. He won't find out," he replied. I refused again, but he insisted. He was trying so hard to convince me that he was literally forcing me to agree. The worst thing was he was holding his dental drill and started to become violent with it. He started to push it harder and harder into my teeth. I couldn't see, but I knew something bad was going on and he was intentionally doing it to me. I could feel more and more pain while he was doing this. "You will go with me, right? Just for a tea. Just for a tea, okay?" He was repeating it over and over again. I stopped replying to him, and now I was just looking for a way to escape. But I didn't want to hurt myself with all those dental equipment, so I just didn't move. I could feel he was drilling in my tooth harder and harder. I felt like crying from the pain, but I didn't want to show him that I am an easy target. Finally, I said to him, "Okay, I will go with you." His face instantly turned from angry to cheerful, and he said, "Sweet," with a big smile like nothing had happened. Then he stepped away from me to grab something from the table, and I took my chance to hit him on the head with any item next to my chair, and I ran away from the clinic as fast as I can. I wasn't even trying to look behind me if he was chasing me or if he was still inside. I just want to escape from this crazy maniac. When I ran out of breath after a few blocks, I stopped to take some air. Fortunately, I couldn't spot him anywhere. Then I realized something was pouring out of my mouth. It was blood. He did something to me and I couldn't see how bad it was. I slowly placed my finger into my mouth and checked every tooth. I came across something that felt really weird. I counted all of them and realized that there was something quite missing. But then I realized He just drilled my tooth deeper into my gums. I came back to my house and told everything in tears to my boyfriend. He drove me to the police station and I gave a statement. They directed us to the state dental clinic to check for damages. The damages were so bad that they had to remove my tooth. I couldn't take it anymore and bursted out into tears. It was so hard for me because we couldn't even afford an implant back then. Meanwhile, the police drove to that guy's clinic to take him to custody. He insisted that he was innocent. It was just a medical mistake and that I was crazy. He testified that I made it all up. If you want to know how it all ended, then here is the harsh reality. Unfortunately, the law system favors the rich people, and he was only fined a few thousands as a punishment. I bet he had deals with the police too. He didn't go to jail nor was forced to close his dental clinic. I couldn't afford a good lawyer, so I couldn't do much back then. And this crazy maniac is still seeing patients. I remembered the name of the lady through an ID from her wallet and asked the police about her. They told me that the lady was reported missing about a week ago, and nothing more. Up to this day, all I'm wondering is that what he did to that lady and how many more women did that maniac sexually harass and have physically hurted over the course of his time operating the clinic.
Back when I was 17, I used to babysit for our neighbor, who at the time was a single mother who happened to be going through a particularly nasty divorce. She had 2 young sons, one of which was 8 years old, while the other was only around 18 months. They were absolutely adorable and very well-behaved kids, but you could tell that they were going through a lot, and the older one definitely showed signs of stress over the whole thing. And I'll never forget the time he asked me why his daddy couldn't live with them anymore, and it honestly broke my heart. Not because I didn't have an answer for him, but because to hear it would have just been too much to bear. Too much for anyone to bear. Anyway, after a few months of being alone, she finally decided to get back on the old dating horse. I was so happy for her. After such a rough time, she deserved to find happiness again, to find someone who had the wherewithal to be a real father to these 2 adorable little boys. So one night she leaves on her date and says she'll be back around midnight and not a moment later. Only she doesn't tell me exactly where she's going, and I have no way to contact her because this was back in the 80s and no one had a cell phone. Well, they did exist, but not in the available commercial sense. It was all landlines back then. Otherwise, this might not have gone the way it did. So on the night in question, I'm chilling on the couch, absent-mindedly flicking through the TV channels. I put the kids to bed an hour previous. They're sleeping like rocks and everything seems fine and dandy. When suddenly there's a knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but then again, it wasn't my house, so I felt kind of obligated to answer and take a message or whatever. Only as I started walking down the hallway towards the front door, whoever is on the other side starts banging against it and cursing up a storm. "Cheryl, I know you're in there. Open the door." Now, what was exactly said, I don't remember, but I'm not keen on repeating some of the words they used. It was really, really harsh. So I'm just frozen, looking at the door in total fright when the oldest boy came flying out of his room and down the stairs, running to the door and yelling, "Daddy's home!" I grab him, pull him away from the door. I had no idea what this guy's intentions were, and after all, they were probably divorced for a freaking reason. But I almost fainted with fear when I hear the words, "I got my shotgun in my truck, and tonight, I'm going to teach you a lesson you'll never forget." He screams this, but then I hear his footsteps move up the gravel path. It appeared he wasn't bluffing at all. And if that was the case, then our lives were clearly in danger. When he gets back, he's banging on the door and threatening to start shooting through it if no one opens. I grab both kids and run out the back door and across the street to my house where my mom calls the police. When the police arrive a few minutes later, they actually find the ex-husband taking a massive dump on Cheryl's porch. He was arrested, and I wait with the kids at my house for their mom to show up. Everyone was in tears by that point, even my mom, who was normally a pretty reserved woman. I mean, maybe he was just having a manic episode and no one was in real danger, but honestly, it was one of the most terrifying nights of my entire life. When my grandfather was younger, he became the principal of an elementary school. He was in his late 20s, early 30s at the time, and despite being young, he was a born leader. He was a great principal and everyone loved him. I can attest to that as I attended multiple award ceremonies for him, and the respect and admiration he received was crazy. There was a young boy at the school who was having behavioral issues in class, and my grandfather saw that the kid didn't have a lot of parental support. So he called in his father and had talked with him about spending more time with his son and just a general parenting session. It turned out that all the boy needed was his dad's attention, and after a few weeks, he was a happy model student. Whenever my grandfather would leave school late, he would see the dad was playing basketball with his son after he got home from work. It was one of those moments that he took pride in, being able to make a difference in people's lives. However, not everything had such an easy solution, and my grandfather found himself having to deal with an employee, Stanley the janitor, who was showing up to work drunk. Stanley was an alcoholic with a mean streak, and my grandfather tried on multiple occasions to deal with his behavior. Finally, one day Stanley showed up so drunk that my grandfather sent him home and called the superintendent to let him know he was going to be firing him the next morning after he sobered up. He then warned them to let him deal with it when Stanley was sober, because he was not a stable person. As it goes in these kinds of stories, the superintendent was furious and decided that he was going to call Stanley himself and fire him despite my grandfather's warning. No one called my grandfather to tell him about it either, so he was completely in the dark and thought he could deal with it in the morning. Stanley was furious and went to the school that evening. He searched the offices, my grandfather's included, and tore things apart until he finally had what he wanted. He was in a blaze of fury, and on his way out, he saw the father and his son playing basketball. He walked towards them and pulled something out of his trousers. It was a gun. He then proceeded to shoot the little boy, killing him instantly. The father was so upset, was hysterically crying, but somehow managed to get the gun away from Stanley and shoot him. My grandfather was called to the elementary school immediately by the police because there were 2 dead bodies. The little boy and Stanley were dead. What was even worse was the crying from the father and him saying that he couldn't save his son. It was clear that he could never forgive himself for that day. My grandfather was pulled aside by one of the police who had searched Stanley for evidence. They had found a hit list of people that he was going to kill, and all the addresses of those people that he had retrieved when he searched the offices. My grandfather was number 1 on that list. So, if it weren't for that father, it's likely that I would never been able to meet my grandfather, and possibly my mother and grandmother would have been killed if Stanley had been able to complete his mission. To this day, I get goosebumps whenever I hear that story, and it's just so chilling. My grandfather never uttered a single word about this after his initial recount, and my mother made me swear to never tell him I knew. He carried the weight of that boy's death on him until the day he died. I live in a house compound, and one day me and my family were visiting a friend's house. After a couple of hours, my mom and my friend's mom asked us to go fetch something from my house. So we go back to my home, which is a long way from his, and the walk seemed uncomfortably long and creepy and had an eerie atmosphere for some reason. After ages of walking, we reach my house and we get the thing they needed, which was inside the house. So I unlocked the door and got the object, and I noticed the bathroom door was lit, and the exhaust fan was on, which we usually turn off unless someone is using the toilet. But I didn't give that any attention and thought my dad was using the toilet since he wasn't in my friend's house when we left. So me and my buddy decided to wait outside the house for my dad to finish, and I occasionally went to the small window outside the bathroom and called for my dad, but I didn't get an answer. But I heard someone humming and singing, so I thought that he was having a good time. After a good half an hour passed, I started feeling uneasy and told my friend we had to leave because our parents are probably angry now. When we arrived at his house, we were shocked to see my dad sitting and talking to my friend's parents. We asked him, "Where were you?" And he said, "I didn't go anywhere. I just stayed here since we first came." This made me scared because my family had been here for 3 hours, and we just waited for my dad for 1 hour. I go ask my sister the same question and get the same response. Someone was surely in my bathroom. After the visit is done, we go back home just to find the front door, which I locked and unlocked, and the bathroom door was wide open. My family acted normally, but I was completely freaking out, and I couldn't get any sleep that night. First and last time I babysat, back when I was 16 in the early 80s. I'd just gotten a driver's license and needed gas and insurance money for the old beat-up car I'd bought. I was watching two boys, about 6 and 10, while parents went out to celebrate some anniversary or something. They had promised to be home at 11. At the time, cell phones were pretty rare, so no way to contact them other than calling the restaurant. Evening was going great until about 9:30 when their large, aggressive Doberman goes crazy running around the house barking and growling before running into the basement, refusing to come up. Sort of freaks me out a bit because this dog is huge, aggressive, and very protective of the house and kids. I do a quick check of the house and kids and everyone was okay. I let the dog stay in the basement, put kids to bed at around 10 as instructed by the parents. Job done. So I'm watching TV at around 10:30 when suddenly I begin to smell something burning. Running into the youngest boy's room and find the oldest boy in bed with him. Both are asleep, so I wake them both and tell them that we need to get the dog and go outside. But the dog just straight up refuses to leave the basement. And I had to prioritize. So I get the kids outside and tell them to sit in the front yard while I go in to call the fire department. Not showing good judgment here, but I was 16. Oldest says, "I left a candle burning under my bed." As I go back in, yup, a candle under their bed, since apparently monsters couldn't live anywhere where there's light. I know, dumb kids. As I open the door to go back in, there's this huge explosion behind me across the street and power goes out. The kids start screaming and follow me back into the house. I grab the phone, but there's no dial tone. I get the kids out of the house again, onto the back porch this time and make it really clear that they're to stay there. But I can still hear the dog whimpering in the basement. I run to the oldest kid's bedroom with the fire extinguisher and flashlight from the kitchen and look under the bed through hazy smoke. The offending candle has gone out, but has burnt a hole in the box spring, which also has gone out. I flip the box spring and blast it with the extinguisher just in case. I then run to the front porch to see the transformer on a telephone pole had exploded. A lightning pole... What? Lighting the pole on fire and taking out the phone and electricity service for the street. I run and check on the box springs, which are still out. I open the bedroom windows to air out the room, then get the kids off the back porch into the living room onto the couch, where they both are just crying their eyes out. The oldest was apologizing for the fire, but insisted that if he didn't keep the candle lit, then, of course, monsters would get him. Fire department shows up for the transformer at around 11. Kids fall asleep on the couch at around midnight after watching the firemen across the street put out the transformer fire, and the power comes back on at about 1:30 a.m. The parents show up at 2:30 a.m. when they were supposed to be back by 11. They're somewhat buzzed and start complaining that the kids are not in bed and the oldest room is trashed with a flipped-over mattress and dry fire extinguisher powder covering the box springs. And to add insult to injury, they straight up refuse to pay me. The situation gets really tense, and would you believe it? The Doberman picks this time to come out of the basement and starts aggressively growling at me. Walked out with $1 to my name, and I never babysat again. For the longest time, I was a tombstone caretaker for a cemetery in rural Georgia. It was only a summertime job for a 16-year-old, nothing too crazy, just cleaning off the grime and build up dirt from off of the tombstones and stuff. Now, to kind of set the scene a little, the cemetery included one building that housed bathrooms for the 5 caretakers employed by the cemetery, in addition to one small, simple mausoleum. Other than that, it was all just flat earth with tombstones littering the entire site. The whole place felt pretty cut off too, as surrounding the place were some of the densest forests in the entire state of Georgia. Naturally, because of the eerie surroundings, I was always a little bit more paranoid than maybe I should have been. That, and I watch a ton of horror movies and such, which I get is a terrible combo for someone working at a cemetery. So one night, I'm doing my rounds when I have to go into the small mausoleum. We had some of the wealthier families in the area entombed within, and it was my job to go in, make sure all was neat and clean, making sure it met the standards of these uppity folks. I'm walking over to it, and right off the bat, I feel like something is off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, just this general sense that I wasn't alone. That's about the time that I noticed candlelight coming from the small mausoleum. I was also pretty certain that I could hear voices coming from inside too, like younger voices, kids my age at the time. They were giggling and laughing, and it didn't sound particularly wholesome. Now, I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave the cemetery, but I also wasn't about to potentially take on a bunch of drunk teenagers on my own, as I definitely would have got my butt whooped. So I called the lone security officer on duty, the dude that does a few rounds on the lot. He was an older, retired cop, but he was definitely tough, and I knew he'd jumped at the chance to help me out. When the ex-cop finally turns up, we both go inside. It was empty, which made absolutely no sense, as I'd literally just heard voices and stuff inside. And there were indeed lit candles inside, burning around one of the tombs, a tomb that had been opened up to reveal the remains of a child-sized skeleton. Nothing other than that was disturbed, but that was bad enough, mainly because the open tomb contained a rotten old child's doll, like the knitted kind. It was seriously disturbing to see that old thing smiling away whilst lying hand in hand with an actual kid skeleton. Me and the security guard quickly got out of there, doing a lightning sweep of the grounds to try to at least get eyes on these sick idiots that desecrated that girl's final resting place. Neither of us saw a soul, which was more frustrating than it was scary, and after about a quarter of an hour, we met back at the mausoleum to set the girl's grave in order by sliding the stone tablet back on top of the tomb. When we stepped inside, the doll that was previously hand in hand with the dead girl was sitting on the other side of the mausoleum, like just sat there upright, with that same uneven smile stitched across her face. Whoever was messing with us had actually gone back to move that doll to taunt us. I quit the next day and never went back, not even to visit. Okay, so years ago, my dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did yard work, mowing, weeding, tended to flower beds, etc., and aside from the occasional shadows seen out of the corner of my eye or hearing strange sounds, the cemetery was actually quite a peaceful little place. But the strangest is when you have a burial in the crypts. Basically, you dig down about 5 or 6 feet to expose a giant pair of stone slab doors. You pull the stone doors off and then drop down into a tiny, cold, dark room. These rooms can either fit 2 full-size coffins, 4 children's coffins, by far the hardest to deal with, or years and years worth of cremated remains. So back in the 50s and 60s, families would purchase one crypt and the entire family tree would be cremated and interred inside it. Some just put the cremated remains in it and close it up, but others lit candles and leave mementos, flowers and souvenirs, pictures and stuff like that. It's really creepy opening up one of those things after like 50 plus years and finding all kinds of melted candles and old pictures of the deceased people inside. Not only that, but when you hop down in there enough times, eventually you have a weird realization that you are at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. And that one day, inevitably, you're going to be joining them. Another time, my best friend and I were earning a little money over summer at the cemetery, working as groundskeepers when we were juniors and seniors. It was easy money. We got paid $5 an hour, mostly for edging or trimming and generally keeping the whole place nice and tidy. We raked a lot of leaves and dug a lot of holes that summer, but we also got to tear around the grounds in what was basically a souped-up golf cart with our tools in the back. There was a lot of dead flowers to dig up, not to mention a lot of empty liquor bottles, beer cans, and unfortunately on occasion, even some used condoms. There was a widow who left scribbled notes on her husband's grave, almost all of them completely illegible. Also a lot of sodden stuffed animals left on the graves of children. It felt so wrong throwing that stuff in the trash, and take my word on it that it sucked even harder than digging holes. It was annoying to work in the rain, and it rained often, but it was truly a gravy job, no puns intended. The creepiest thing I saw was one of the old-style baby dolls that had been left on a graveyard. Not inherently spooky, I know, but what creeped us out was the fact that it was badly burned, almost like someone had gone over it with a blowtorch or something. Not just that either. It had what we discovered to be these big iron nails that had been driven into the spaces its eyes should have been. Probably just some local college kids playing a prank or something. Heck, it could have been my buddy, but he never admitted to it. It just really creeped me out to see that thing one early morning when there wasn't another soul in sight. Having said that, there was something far, far worse I encountered while doing that job. It was the naked corpse of a young woman my age, left neatly with her arms at her sides one foggy Saturday morning. She had been strangled right there. Whoever murdered her had also bludgeoned her horribly. She was identified quickly, and it turned out that she was a student at a neighboring high school, but her clothes were never found, and to my knowledge, her murder was never, ever solved. My friend and I were grilled by police on 2 separate occasions, and honestly, I think that was the scariest part, knowing we were actually implicated in the murder. But we didn't know a thing, and each had alibis, so thankfully we were eventually rolled out, and thankfully, the cops never bothered us anymore. I just pray that she's resting in peace. Former funeral director here. A bit of a setup first. The cemetery I run is real old, like by a good few hundred years. At least it must be, since the church next to it was constructed during the 17th century. Considering the fact that it is a pretty rural place as well, most people back in the day were buried with only wooden crosses and such, no stone or marble. So as time goes on, crosses rot and wither away, new people get buried, etc. Nowadays, due to less people living out here in the sticks, which means our budget is increasingly limited, the cemetery is really run down and overgrown. It is a really pretty place, and it's honestly pretty depressing. So as some of you can imagine, when you keep burying bodies in the same small patch of dirt for that many centuries, eventually the soil has been worked over dozens and dozens of times. So in the end, it consists of mainly bone meal. You can't even rake over the flower beds there without accidentally uncovering some teeth or finger bones or something equally grim. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under the thin turf. The soil sort of resembles the kind of dirt you see near sandy beaches, except on closer examination, all the light-colored parts are just bone fragments rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, just super eerie until you eventually get used to it. You learn to treat anything recognizable as human remains with respect and just tuck it away out of sight under the plant or whatever else you were putting there. Anyway, so someone was taking care of their relative's grave and decided to expand the area around the grave. For some reason, the people around her are not particularly fond of grass, rather preferring a well-leveled ground with Zen garden lines made with a rake. The person removed the grass and was sprucing up the place with a rake when they pulled up a bunch of snow-white hair from the dirt. They must have just freaked out and ran out of there, leaving the cemetery attendant to stumble across what was essentially hair coming out of the ground. She reported it to the church and supposedly they reburied the remains. Even with all my years as an undertaker, I'm not entirely sure how there could have been a body so close to the surface. But there's another incident that sticks with me even more than that one. My business partner and I had just gotten back to the funeral home from a call for a 27-year-old woman who tragically passed away due to terminal cancer. As we were moving her body from the cot to an embalming table, we heard an audible click, and the radio across the room turned on full volume of static. It's one of those old radios you turn the volume dial until it clicks to turn it on. We both looked at each other, pale as ghosts. He happened to be extremely religious, and this event visibly shook him. He found an excuse to leave early not long after the incident. So I shut the radio off as I typically use my iPhone to listen to music while doing embalming work. When I'd finished the procedure and was attempting to move her from the embalming table to a dressing table, I heard that click from the old radio and it turned on full volume yet again. At this point, I was fairly freaked out and got out of there not long after. My partner and I never spoke of it again, and nothing like that had ever occurred to my knowledge before or after.
So this happened back in 6th grade, and I think it's the closest I've ever come to dying. At the school I went to, we always used to have some big end-of-the-year field trip. We'd usually go to some city and look at all the important or historic buildings, have lunch, learn some things, and leave. That year, we were going to New York, and me and a couple of friends planned what we wanted to do. We wanted to go do our own thing, go shopping, get some new clothes, that kind of thing. Only when we got to school the next day, the teachers made it really clear we had to stick with the group. But since we were all stupid, rebellious 6th graders, we decided we'd just have to work around that. On the ride to New York, me, my friend Olivia, and my friend Devin decided we were going to leave the group and do whatever we wanted. Our class was pretty big, almost 60 of us, because they put 5th, 6th, and 7th graders together. So we thought if we weren't gone too long, nobody would notice. We had brought money and we had planned on buying tons of stuff, because even though we were a big class, we lived in a small town with only a couple of stores. Olivia loved shopping, and she had actually researched the area we were going to be around and picked out all the good stores. She even made us a little map. She was good at that kind of stuff. Anyways, when we got to New York, Devin chickened out because his parents were pretty strict and he didn't want to get his phone taken away again. Olivia and I just decided that he could just give us some money and we'd buy his stuff for him. So we did that, and after they herded everyone off the bus, we kind of lingered back. We were right about them being distracted by everyone else because we got away no problem. Olivia's map worked out pretty good, and we were gone probably around 10 or 20 minutes before things started getting crazy. We had just left the store, and Olivia was carrying her shopping bags when this guy noticed us. It probably wasn't hard to pick us out. 2 little 6th graders walking around alone, carrying a ton of clothes. He started calling out to us, saying how he could buy us more clothes, all the jewelry we wanted, and if only we would just come with him. We didn't believe him, of course. We just kept walking, heading on to the next store. Only this guy wouldn't stop talking. He started following us now, and getting kind of angry that we wouldn't answer him. I told him to buzz off because I thought that he would take a hint. There were tons of people around, and we figured he couldn't really kidnap us in front of 200 people. But he kept following us, and he started getting a lot closer. He had probably been 30 or 40 yards back, where we could barely see him over the people, but now he was only 15 or 20 feet. And that's when we started panicking, because God, there's a potential kidnapper after us, and we had no idea where the group was. We decided to split off from the sidewalk and head down into some alley because we figured people would call out the guy if he started following us. But of course, it was New York, and everybody else was wrapped up in their own little problems. So now we're walking down this dark alley, and this guy is still after us. He fell a little back, probably back to about 30 feet now, but now he's not pretending to be a good guy. He's talking about how he's going to kill us, and how they're never going to find our bodies, and how much fun he's going to have with us, and he's smiling this deranged grin the whole time. We're both on the verge of tears now, because we figured this sociopath is about to have his way with us. Olivia just decides to drop her stuff and yells, "Run!" So we both start booking it, and we're probably around halfway through this alley. But then she turns around and she screams. So I turn around and I see this psychopath is now running after us too, and he has a knife. We're both screaming now, and I'm running faster than I ever have before, and we just run out of the alley back into this crowd of people. And as we try to get into this group of people to make sure this guy can't stab us to death, I turn around and he's just standing back in the alley, smiling. And I turn back around and this random lady is asking us what's wrong because we're both sobbing and Olivia's dress is ripped and I'm bleeding because my arms scrape the wall and we're crying so hard we can barely talk. As soon as we can actually manage to talk, we tell her about our school, and she looks it up and calls them, and we somehow manage to find our group again. We're both forced to stay right next to the teacher because they don't trust us anymore, and I honestly don't blame them. We didn't even tell them about the man though. And as soon as I get home, I'm grounded and my phone is taken away. But still, nobody but me and Olivia knows about that man. School ends a couple of days later and I get my phone back, so I text Olivia and she sends me a picture of our class in front of some important building and says, "Look in the bottom left corner." And that man is in it, mostly hidden behind some wall, but you can still see his face, smiling that deranged grin for the camera. We never really talked about the man again. I didn't want to bring it up and Olivia didn't either. I'm terrified of cities now. I like to stick to a couple of towns near me and that's it. There's a much lower chance of running into any psychopaths. This happened to me when I was in first grade, so about 6 or 7 years old. I'm now in my mid-20s. Every year, the first graders take a trip to the zoo, about an hour away from our town. I was a shy little girl, so I spent most of the bus ride staring out the window while the other kids were busy conversing with each other. A Jeep pulls up where I have a clear look into the vehicle and at the driver. We were on the interstate. I am seeing him playing with something under his shirt, all the while looking at me and then back at the road, back at me and so forth. One hand on the wheel and the other fiddling with whatever was under his shirt. I couldn't keep my eyes off of him, fascinated about what he was hiding. And then he lifted his shirt. And yup, I got a good look at what he was playing with the whole time. He freaking waved at me. Granted, I was a little girl and had never seen one before, nor did I understand why he was doing what he was doing. A girl that was near me asked what I was looking at, and then she got to see for herself. She started hollering, and I swear to God, all the kids on the bus ran to the window to see what was going on. The Jeep gunned off, and I'm sure it got off the next exit. I remember telling my mom about it when I got home, but then I just sort of blocked it out of my mind. It was only several years later when I had 2 daughters of my own that I recalled this event, and just last night I was talking to my mom about it, wishing that I had been more mature and had thought to get his license plate number or something. All I remember is that it was a Jeep or SUV of some type and some middle-aged white guy. I just hope and pray to God that I, nor any other child in their life, ever has to go through or see something like that again. When I was in high school, my 2 closest friends were Colin and Eric. They were both tallish, skinny guys. I was a small young woman who, as a 16-year-old, could pass for 13. One night we went for a walk. Well, I was walking and the 2 guys were rollerblading slowly along. To get to my home, we went through the middle school parking lot. The lot was at the front of the school and a row of trees separated the lot and the road. Just as we entered the lot, conversation broke as Eric and Colin decided to race to the end. They took off. As I was walking, a car pulled into the lot and slowly drove up beside me. It was about 10 o'clock at night, but the lights on the front of the school meant I could see the car pretty clearly. It was navy blue and its black windows were tinted dark. There were no decals or anything on it, nothing that said security or neighborhood watch. The driver was a Caucasian man, probably in his late 20s. He didn't look overweight, but his face was wide and looked a bit swollen or something. He was wearing a red shirt, no uniform. He rolled down his window and spoke to me. "Hey, you're not allowed to be here. You're trespassing." I was confused. I stopped walking and took a small step toward the car to hear him better.
Pardon me? I'm going to have to take you downtown. Get in the car.
Now, it was pretty clear this guy wasn't security or a cop, so I immediately put more distance between myself and the car. In a loud, firm voice, I said,
No.
The driver looked confused at that. I glanced towards the end of the parking lot. Eric and Colin had seen the car and were skating back quickly. He tried again.
You're in a lot of trouble. Get in the car. No.
At that moment, Colin and Eric reached me. I think one of them asked the driver who he is. The guy didn't say a word and just pulled away quickly. We all three discussed how creepy that was as we continued our walk. When I got home and said goodbye to the guys, I went inside and told my mom about the incident. She thought I was overreacting. I found the non-emergency number for police and gave them a call. They told me that the middle school did have a security officer there, that there was no reason that he would have had any right to ask me to get inside of his car. I have grapheme to color synesthesia, which gives me a very good memory for numbers and letters. I remembered the driver's license plate and told the police, but I'm not sure if anything came of it. I moved into a large studio apartment complex a few months ago. I am a single female with a 2-year-old daughter. My sister and a few of her friends came over about 3 weeks ago to hang out, have some beers, and play Cards Against Humanity. My studio has an enclosed patio, save for a door-size opening, no gate or door. Since my child was sleeping, I had everyone chill outside on the patio. We were having a great time, joking, talking, and listening to low-playing music when the security guard entered my patio.
Hi there. Are we being too loud? Has someone placed a complaint? No. You guys are fine. Just doing my rounds.
He lingered for a minute more, then strolled out into the night. We continued our activities and didn't really give him a second thought. He returned about 25 minutes later, right after most of the group had left. Only my sister, her friend Cody, and I remained. He was an overweight, late 40s to early 50s white male and wore glasses. He strolls into my patio once again and strikes up conversation. We learned he is a retired cop that had quit the force after suffering a heart attack on duty. He states he had to undergo a quintuple bypass surgery, and after recovery, he started night security jobs. I felt sorry for him because of his medical history and sat and listened to him for quite a while. He must have stayed at least 30 minutes before my sister got uncomfortable and loudly announced that we were going to bed. He bid us good night and left. Once again, my sister said that she didn't like the way that he was looking at me, and she thought that he took a liking to me. I initially told her she was reading into it too much and that the dude was just lonely and had a long shift ahead. A week and a half later, my sister is visiting again and we are sitting inside my place talking. My studio has a black screen door, which is visible to see through, and a wood door. I had the screen locked and the wood door wide open to let some air in. My sister is talking to me and I have the sensation that someone is looking at me, so I glance up. The security guard is standing at the doorway of my patio, staring. I say hello and he jerks forward, as if expecting an invitation in or something. But I turn my attention back to my sister, and when I glance back again, he's gone. This week on Tuesday, I took a shower and threw on my red silk Japanese-style robe. I was washing dishes for about 25 minutes and had poured a glass of wine. I turned from the kitchen to sit on my couch, and I strangled a scream. The security guard is almost pressed up against my screen door, staring straight at me through the foot-long crack of the wooden door. I was so startled and shaken, but the first thing I did was make sure my robe wasn't exposing me. I ran up to the screen.
What are you doing? You scared me.
No emotion and no apology.
I was just doing my rounds.
My scalp is crawling and I'm still shaky.
Okay, well, I'm going to bed now.
He is still right up next to the screen door, all the way inside my patio, and turns and looks at my beach cruiser parked against the wall.
Oh, you have a bike? You should put that inside because someone could take it.
Yeah, I'll get to it. I pretty much slammed the door shut and locked the door. I sit down with the wine and calm my nerves. I was shaken up but wasn't sure if he really was being a creeper or just a lonely individual that was looking for someone that had expressed interest.
After a debate with my friends and sister, I contacted the property manager. I was actually surprised at how quickly it escalated. They took my verbal incident report over the phone and just informed me today that the guy has been fired. The property manager told me to call the police if I see him on my premises again.